Hi, thank you so much for coming, joining this conversation. I'm going to read the bios for these three artists, and we'll go from there. Just a minute. So Maryse first. Maryse Larivière is an artist, writer, and scholar based in Montreal whose work reimagines how we engage with the textual, visual, and social through bodily and emotional encounters. Her artistic practice crosses art, literature, and theory, and takes the form of text, performance, sculpture, collage, print, and film. Recent exhibitions include Under the Cave of Winds, at the Untitled Art Society in Calgary, Garden Gossip at the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Centre of the Arts, and then Echoes from Boston at DNA Art Space in London. Her books of poetry include Orgazing, Humsinger, and Where Wildflowers Grow. Larivière was the 2016-2017 writer-in-residence at Gallery 44 in Toronto, and has contributed writings to a variety of platforms, including C Magazine, Essay, and Canadian Art. Chloë. Chloë is a Montreal-based multidisciplinary artist, musician, and writer who works collaboratively with Yaniya Lee. Their joint practice includes video, photography, dance, print, and installation, all of which center transformative relationships between bodies and inanimate objects. Their recent solo exhibitions include Cirque Art Actuel at Montreal, I feel like the sound is changing, Montreal's Kiel Gallery, St. Cloud State University, Minnesota, and the Mat Lab at the University of Texas. Chloë has a BFA from Concordia University and very recently an MFA, congratulations, from York University, and is currently in residence at the Darling Foundry. With chronic illness as her primary methodology, she is constantly strategizing new ways to work from bed. Finally, Celia, who just had an opening last week in Montreal, holds an MFA from Concordia University with a concentration in photography. Her work is shown in solo and group exhibitions at 811 in Toronto, Arsenal Contemporary in New York, Esker Foundation Calgary, and the Banff Centre Banff. The practice of Celia's practice presents assemblages and arrangements, following a logic that is at once internal and associative. Her photographs offer a considered way of looking at collected objects within the visual rhetoric of the studio, referencing histories and the overarching structures of still life, interior arrangement, and the placement of objects for display and exhibition. Her photographs nonetheless confound the conditions through which everyday objects are usually interpreted and the ways we navigate the material world. She has recently been creating images out of the studio again, particularly at and around archaeological sites. Her photographs attest to an interest for the physical presence of inanimate objects while alluding to their transformation through photography. Her practice now extends in analog cinema and ceramics. So that was very full. I'm still going to ask you to talk about, thanks for being here again. I'm still going to ask you to talk about some recent projects, just maybe to see where you're at now. These bios give a pretty comprehensive view of your relationship to different mediums, but perhaps you could, I don't know who wants to go first, but talk about one thing that you've been working on that's a major project and what it was about, just briefly.
So that means me? Okay. My most recent project is Under the Cave of Winds, which consists of a 16 millimeter black and white film, sculptures, and a book, and a sound work as well that was made by a collaborator, Cosima Friesen. The project hinged on this book, actually, which is an experimental novel. It's an artist book, which, in a nutshell, is the tribulations of these women trying to escape representation.
Thank you.
My recent work involves a suite of videos. The most recent one of which is called What Do Stones Smell Like in the Forest? And it'll be on view at FOFA Gallery as of next week. It's like a part 2 project with a previously shown video called Is It the Sun or the Asphalt? All I See is Bright Black. And both of these projects are choreographies that are specifically made for the camera. So dancers working to the camera with a series of sculptural props that change their bodily movements and extend their body into space. Both of the videos have original scores and like function as installations within gallery spaces. So they're really meant to be seen as gallery videos and not like online, for instance, because they're both dual channel. And in this suite and in the next video that me and my collaborator Yannick are working on, it really deals a lot with my own invisible disabilities and kind of finding new ways to use the body through material relationships.
My most recent project is on view currently at Parisian Laundry, which isn't too far from here. It's called Toujours la coquille de l'autre, always the shell of another. And it's an exhibition that presents photographs and a collection of ceramic objects, as well as a 60mm film that plays on a loop. And it makes parallels between objects sort of across locations and across time, with smaller objects that are collected in the studio, as well as objects that I make myself, and ancient artifacts from archaeological sites and museums, and one specific book about Delphi.
Okay. I'm going to start by asking Chloe, because when I was thinking of what we could talk about, I knew I wanted to talk to all of you, and then was looking for these links between your work, and I thought of, well, this is the paper art fair, and sort of how I've seen yours and Yannick's practice develop. I mean, it's gone beyond what I even know. You were telling me about the dance and the videos recently. Maybe you could talk about just how you went as Siri Pop from printmaking to sculpture to installation of video. Just what has that trajectory been?
Okay, well, in a nutshell,
Just did it.
I don't understand why this is doing that. I spent like almost 20 years in punk bands. I have a lot of experience with microphones, and I never had that experience. So in a nutshell, me and Yannick, when we started making posters together in 1999, we were both musicians playing in like avant rock bands around the city, and making posters together was kind of our way to like trick people into coming to our shows. And, you know, being both like, you know, from suburban backgrounds, we were really like obsessed with being in the city, and especially like Montreal, late 90s, early aughts was a good post-apocalyptic city to be in. So right away, you know, noticing the amount of posters that we would produce, and then being on the street and noticing the way that they would decay in time, and the way that they would, you know, be partially covered by other things, torn down, that they would fade in the sun, we right away started seeing this as like a type of parallel performance to our practice as musicians. And it was from kind of seeing the like real material aspects of the screen printed paper existing in time and space that then led us to do installations that were set up so that, you know, the paper and other fragile materials that we would work with would also decay by people visiting the space, by the weight of the objects onto each other, and always kind of framing these things as performance, I guess, is what led us into working with dance, and then, like, you know, dance for video, dance for photography, and stuff like that. We're still using props that are made of paper, that are made of Tyvek, that are made of rubber, things that do change, and where the usage of the props, of the backdrops, of the objects, the time inscribes itself on them. They decay over time and change over time, and we can repurpose and reuse them. So we see the objects in our installations or the objects in our dance pieces as also being like micro performances in of themselves. So basically just seeing the way that material plays out with bodies, with the elements, with the sun as being all performative.
That's amazing. That leads directly into sort of Maryse, we were speaking recently about how your practice emerged from when you started out in art school, you were doing performance. And I see so many performative aspects of your writing practice now. I wonder if you could talk about that transition from doing straight performance and then moving into other forms.
Well, it's interesting because I've only noticed recently how the narrative from the book is one that I've followed myself. This idea of this escape out of representation. I studied at Concordia, as well as my colleagues here, in the photo department. So my practice was initially quite invested in photography. It was quite image-based, and which I'm still, through moving images now, mostly. But my photography practice was very performative. So when I'm through my master degree, I started actually performing directly and using text as a way to activate the performance. But I was mostly interested in artist multiples, posters as well, which is something actually is something like like being in Montreal and being around like Pop Montreal and all these like musical activities was quite part of where I was also interested in these practices, but also going to Toronto where Art Metropole publishes and distributes these artistic artifacts. Anyways, but then like through doing these performances where sorry. Slowly my practice became much more involved with writing and further dematerialized. These performances further dematerialized into a writing practice. And so I started performing only within the page of the book through the narration of a story.
Is it because you didn't want to perform with your body anymore?
I was mostly interested in how the female body would be represented, and how with writing you can access maybe a little more fluid contour of the female body, maybe. So these are the sort of questions I was interested in.
And it goes further, like the materiality and the way that your poetry, especially when you write, it comes off the page in this different way. I've seen you read and then you're sort of singing like a bird. So you draw the world and representations in the world into words. I'm really worried about this sound, into language, and then after that it's sort of...
Well, I guess like the other aspects of my another side of my thinking around these issues is that I was also interested in how to go beyond interpretation, and how how performance can enact ideas and emotions, how to feel and what kind of thinking that produces. So
in the writing.
Yeah, through the writing. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Celia, when we spoke, or when I think of your practice, sometimes it immediately presents as one thing, but then the more I think about it, it goes into this other place. When I first started noticing your work, which was years ago and sort of different than what you do now, there was a lot of images that looked like still lives. I mean, that does resemble your practice now, but I think your thinking behind it is different. And to me, sort of still lives traditionally are sort of allegorical, and there are these musings that are thinking about the nature of life and death. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you try to do with your compositions, like what, as a photographer especially, what's going on in the frame.
Okay. Well, there's many ways, I guess, to answer that question, but I am interested in the idea of still life as sort of a form, but also in the subjects of still life, but how these things sort of move across various periods and still have relevance depending on how you look at them, or I guess when you compose an image, you're putting one thing, well, in the way that I work, I'm bringing several different things together that at first was more of an experiment, and now it's becoming something else as well, where I was interested in seeing how the juxtaposition of these different materials could create something else, and how there's this real sort of communication that exists between objects and material that sort of exists without my implication or without my meddling, but then to sort of point to those things with photography is interesting to me. And the reason why I still work in photography, I suppose, is that things photographed are so completely different from the things themselves, and I'm really interested in that sort of translation of one state to the next, and that's sort of what led me to work in film as well, because it became another manner of looking at a similar subject, but it permitted this sort of animation that isn't in the photographs or isn't possible in the photographs, and showing something that was invisible so far in the photographs, because then the hand is in, and for the people who know the work, I apologize, this sounds really cryptic for anyone who doesn't know the work, but the sort of work that I do in the studio involves placing objects and moving them and photographing them through this process of, trying out different scenarios and seeing the sort of possibilities. And then with the film, I was able to bring the hand in, so the work of the hand becomes visible in the film without it being a direct sort of documentation of what the studio process is. So it sort of moves in between that. And maybe I think this is something I've been interested in you and Yannick's work with, this sort of idea that objects have this, how to say it, I guess agency, or they have this sort of thing that they have on their own that exists without us, and how to tap into that. And sorry, I don't know if that leads into...
I was going to ask this question about conversations that happen in the work between these different materials, and I see that happening.
Well, I mean, Celia, looking at your work with my own interest and understanding of objects, is I've always seen it as very theatrical, where like everything is like, the seashell and the antiquity and the bowl are all like actors that are like being ready to perform in a play. I don't know. I guess I just read everything as like as a performance that is either ongoing or that has been paused.
Well, I like that aspect of time too. Like we talked about, or the influence of documentary on the work that you make, and how it being lens-based in this particular way does something to time in your images. And I think you're extending time as Seri Pop when you make these huge installations. People step into them with the dancers responding and the video having that recording.
But I like this idea of performance. Like there is a certain performativity in these like tasks almost in the studio, and I like that you see that. I guess I don't say that about myself because j'ose pas. But it's like it is in there. There's this sort of method or this action that's happening, but usually that isn't seen. So sort of bringing that in a little more with the film is interesting, I guess, to me.
Yeah, I mean, I would even argue that that's like a common thread between all three of us, because like with Maryse's writing practice, it's like, and your photos, and I feel with the video and installation work I'm doing too, it's extending time and allowing time to kind of repeat and exist in a different non-linear fashion. When you have a book of poetry by an artist and you can read it at your leisure, it's a very different time-based experience than watching a reading. And it's definitely a different time-based experience than seeing like a print of a poem, for instance. And I don't know, just this idea of being able to pause time, reshape time to your own usage. I mean, that's why I am preferring to do choreography for video than live, because as someone who is ill, when something's live, chances are I won't feel well enough to go to it. But when something is ongoing through time, well, then it's much more flexible. So, when time is stopped, when we can pick it up at our leisure, we can interact with it in a very different way.
Maybe, Maryse, you could put in terms of this idea of time, do you think that if you're considering your writing practice as performative, you're able to have a little bit more control is my word, but yeah, you're able to take charge and influence the reader's sort of experience of your performance in that way, durationally?
Well, I find the experience of the book is quite intimate, which is something that I find adds to the work, and how how I'm trying to the kind of atmosphere I'm trying to create for the viewer in the exhibition space, and it does create a different time around the exhibition as well. You can bring that experience back home with you if you decide to take the book home. I guess it creates like a contemplative space as well. I mean, performing the book is a different thing.
Can you tell me about that? Because reading it at home for me is, I think it's funny. Some aspects of it and some aspects of it are very serious. And then when I've seen you read it, it does something entirely different than it does on the page. Yeah,
I mean, I find when I write, I do read it out loud for myself in order to make sure that the voice is correct. Mm-hmm. And the narrative is serious, but at the same time, the way it's written is not. There's a lot of humor in it. It's over the top and ridiculous at points, and I mean it like that. So when I read it to an audience, then people can hear the voice and can hear the tone, which might not be something that's easy to perceive when one is left in the installation. The installation is a bit. Because of the sound piece as well, it's a bit more serious and there's more gravitas to the installation. So reading brings another side to it that's much more playful and funny. Yeah. I'm wondering if in general you could speak to different viewers or audiences' reactions to your work. Like if the intention that you put into it always expresses itself that way, because what you're doing is very complicated and you're playing with these mediums in new ways. What responses have you received? Do they get it? Or does it even matter?
I can give it a shot, I guess. I mean, it's a good question. I actually not. Oh, that's what it is. I don't know if I ever have a really good idea of how things are going to be received, or even actually with the film is really interesting because the film is silent. There's no soundtrack. There's only sort of the sound of the projector in the room. And then when I went down and the room was filled with people and they were watching the film, they were all listening in silence. And everyone who was talking was sort of like chuchoté. They were like whispering. And I guess I was surprised by that reaction, but I also really loved it. There was this sort of a desire to not disturb this silence or the sound of the projector even, and that was pretty interesting to me. But even looking at, and it's interesting what Chloe said with the duration as well, because with a photograph, for example, you can go in front of it, look at it for a second and pass by it, or come back to it and spend more time with it. But with something like film, I'm encouraging you to look at a specific thing for X amount of time. And because the things that are filmed are mostly still also, there's this sort of different experience that happens when you look at something still in time as opposed to looking at something still as a still image. And even if the filmed image is relatively still, there's still some micro movements or even the breath of the film, or some images are handheld, so there is this sort of embodied like trembling that's there as well. So, but I trailed off from your question. Sorry. But time is the time spent with work is something interesting that I pay attention, I guess, when people experience work. I don't know how it is for you.
I mean, for myself, as like a terminally neurotic and very like insecure person by nature, I try to distance myself from viewership as much as possible, because as soon as I think about anything like that at all, I get really like stuck in my head. I rather like think about my own experience within the space. not so much that like I only care what I think of my work, but more like, you know, is something spatially engaging and narratively engaging to me, then maybe it might be to other people. But as soon as I think about what other people might think, I become like completely paralyzed, and I'm up until 5 a.m. being like, what am I doing wrong? How come I'm not more successful? How come everybody hates me? Oh my God. And it, you know, it's just like these little weasels running on a, and it's horrible. So I really try to like have like a real distance between any kind of viewership, and really the only way I can convince myself of that is whenever I'm in a space where my own work is being presented, is to just really like tell myself like this is just a social occasion that happens to have artwork in it. I mean, sorry, I know this isn't a therapy session, but
It's totally valid.
When I write, I usually write for one person. I have an audience of one.
Is it yourself or is it?
No.
It's a person.
One person, you know, a person you want to address. So I find that easier to negotiate with. Obviously, I expect the projects to be seen by more people, but yeah, I do not fall into trying to think about that either. Otherwise, it becomes really stressful and anxiety-inducing. But having one person as one's audience is quite soothing and reassuring, actually, because you're just addressing this one. You know, I choose someone I really like, obviously, and whom I want to address. So that's my trick. Yeah.
Narrative is another thing that I see happening in different, like, fragmented, but yeah, it happens in all of your work in these different ways, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit to narrative and the role of your work. But I'm also curious about your reflection on each other's work, so please, this is great. Maryse, maybe you want to start. Do you tell stories? What are the narratives?
Do I tell stories?
Yeah, what are the narratives? Like, I see, especially in the relationship between some of the collages and the writings that you've done, either art writings about stories that you invent or other people's work.
I always write stories. That's why I'm confused by your question.
Oh,
that's
maybe it's not the best question.
No, it's okay. I guess I'm interested in the kind of. I mean, that's what my work is invested in, trying to produce different narrative about art than the ones that we're used to, the art historical ones or the critical ones. How can we use fiction to our benefit in terms of and being, I mean, that's one thing you were talking about, like being in the studio, it's attentiveness. How can we be attentive to what is going on in the studio while you're working or while you're approaching a work of art? So I make stories about that.
I want to hear what you have to say about narrative. What I mean, I'm trying to think how to
It's
specify this.
It's a matter of sensibility, I guess.
But you're playing it with perspective and narrative. So, for example, let's say the one about the hairdresser. I think you did it when you were writing for the online for Gallery 44. For me, it was like, oh, okay, you're talking about this certain person's practice. Sorry, maybe you could explain a little bit.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, explain the text.
So a little synopsis about this text that Yaniya is discussing right now is a piece I wrote about the work of Valerie Blas, one specific piece that is part of the collection at the Fine Art Museum here in Montreal. And it's made out of fake hair. And so I interviewed a hairdresser who how do you say that? I interviewed a hairdresser who performed conservation work on that sculpture because she was an expert at hair doing. How do you say that?
Yeah, hairdressing.
Hairdressing. Anyways, so I thought it would be interesting to get her perspective on the work of Valerie Blas.
So to me, that's wild and amazing. You're thinking, I want to, yeah.
So not only did I interviewed her, but I interviewed her while she was working on the piece. So I try to be really attentive to the movements that she was performing, and ask her the questions about the material and the products that she was using, and how that could be meaningful in terms of thinking about the work of Valerie. She also happens to know Valerie and have been in the studio with her as much as have been as well. And it is through some of the comments that she made one time about Valerie's work that I actually thought it would be very productive to be speaking with her about Valerie's work. Mostly because through the gesture of through her own gesture of brushing the hair on that sculpture and trying to replace them, she had noticed that how this process for Valerie, in terms of how she think of the space and organize the air in space in a sculptural way, had to do with like a process of thinking that was quite abstract, and had to do with like how do these ideas and feelings and emotions go through the body and into the work. So that's what the discussion between me and this hairdresser is about. Yes.
Thank you. Do you guys want to throw in? It's still, that question's still out there about narrative. In
About
your work.
narrative and how it sort of operates. I mean, I guess I think about it in a more fragmented way. Like there isn't, or another way to put it is to say that there isn't one specific narrative, but there is the possibility of narrative. So that's, I guess, maybe the short answer of how I think about that.
Give me a long answer. Like I'm thinking of that. We've spoken in the past about the Paha Kolia's Evil Mountain exhibition, and you
which
took
is
a
an
bunch
older
of
project.
pictures.
Yeah,
It's much older, but
Yeah.
I really like the process that you went through of taking these stories, making
Yeah.
images, going back, so
Yeah.
that you were translating representations through these different forms. And again, that's drawing out this narrative.
Yeah, well, I guess there was maybe to go back to this project, and I won't spend too much time on it, but there was in that specific project more of a very direct link I was trying to make between these stories that were being told to me and images I wanted to make. But now that sort of link is a lot more muddled, I'd say, and that maybe the stories or the idea of narrative really comes from the things I'm interested in looking at, and how those things can sort of point to others, and how the stories or the histories that are attached to specific stones or monuments sort of bring into other types of stories that are more mythological, but how that then again translates into this very physical manifestation of the thing that is the stone. Or like I guess my interest in narrative is how it can bring to different areas that are more obscure or more opaque, and sort of spend time with that.
You're playing with objects within these compositions recuperates the narratives. And the
It
stories.
sort of does, or it brings into the possibility of a narrative, but it's never like a very specific, clear cut. It's quite the opposite, I guess, of that.
In my own practice, whether it's installation or the dance-based work, I always see everything as a series of events happening in space, where I'm, trying to articulate the agency of the objects, of the materials. What does the printed paper want to do? What does this rubber thing want to do? And also, at the same time, articulating the material condition of the body. So, just to underline that, like, we inhabit our bodies, but we're not as in control of them as we might think we are. And I guess more recently, where I've really, I'm in the early stages of getting my stuff together to apply to doctoral programs, and so having to really figure out what I want to do for the next 5 years, and it really dawned on me that what I'm really trying to get at is that space where the body and the object join, and what kind of transformative power happens within that space. Like when I take this bottle of water and, if I'd use it to turn a light switch or something, how does this change the nature of both my arm and the water bottle. How do things transform when they're, you know, in series with each other, when bodies and things can, you know, combine for either a moment in a performance, or when using an ad hoc object to do something, or more long term when we're thinking of like body modifications or prosthetics or things like that. Like, you know, can we understand that transformation that happens as like quasi magical? Like, can we think of the way that it changes the nature of, you know, how we understand embodiment? So I guess, like, I feel that this kind of thing that I'm trying to get at in that space is kind of the overarching narrative of what I've been working on for a while, and I really want to try to clarify it for myself and delve deeper into that, you know, ideas around animism and, you know, transformative powers.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up for questions unless, there was anything else. Yeah, you wanted to add? Does anybody have a question?
Thanks so much for all of your presentations and discussions. It was really fantastic. And I was so excited about seeing this group of artists together. So the panel was billed as being about material and sort of like responses to or kind of misuses of material. And so far I feel like that hasn't, there's a question I've been wanting to ask around that. Like, in a lot of the materials you're using in each of your practices have a kind of like historical baggage or lineage or like a weight that comes with them. That is both about the object but also about histories of the ways that those materials have been used. And I think ceramics is a great example in Celia's practice. Like, you're working with material that has that history, but often in ways that completely sort of work around or acknowledge in different ways. So I'm wondering if you could each talk maybe a little bit more about that, about the materials you use and how you're thinking about those in relationship to their own histories.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I like that question a lot, though. But it's I sort of approached ceramics as an excuse, or it was a reason. In the beginning, the ceramics was a way to make my own props, I guess, or to make my own objects to photograph them, and that was the main function I was thinking about. I was thinking about them as photographed or photographable objects. But then I completely fell into the pit of ceramics, and I'm actually really in love with the material. But and also really, really humbled by this huge history, and very conscious of my place in it and how I'm approaching it with, like, not skill, but a form of unskillness. But at the same time, I am learning how to do this, and I've taken some courses, and I am learning like more traditional throwing techniques, and sort of thinking about the relationship with those two things, how this my own tiny personal history of learning how to do ceramics shows into the pieces, but also how that can speak to all the rest. But and in terms of research, I guess I'm as interested in pottery from the Minoan era as I am interested in more modernist, ceramicists like Jouve or other people. So it's really interesting to see how this thing has existed in all these different forms across time. And I guess I'm interested in that in a research, but also in a really material way, where the trace to me speaks to photography in so many ways. Like, the trace that forms the thing is the absence of the hand, and then all of these sort of more, I don't know how to qualify those questions, but all these questions that have to do with the trace and the absence of the body that shaped the thing, like, those are really interesting to me, even if the work isn't directly about that. Like, that sort of becomes part of the process. I don't know if that answers, the question. Yeah.
I personally like to really work from a, I guess, naive, de-skilled position, where I specifically gravitate towards doing things that I don't know how to do, so that I can, totally sidestep the baggage. One of my attractions to working with dance was that it was something that I had no training in, no background in. I hadn't even seen a lot of contemporary dance. I just knew a lot of dancers in my milieu and, you know, saw them as, okay, these are people with kinesthetic training. The only thing that I, you know, am really trained in is printmaking. And that's probably why, as the years go by, me and my partner divorce ourselves more from it, or why we were so interested in the first place in, you know, in making posters instead of fine art prints, and, you know, working with non-precious materials. I think that, like, working, you know, as an amateur, as someone who's just interested in the material properties of stuff, for me, gives me a lot of freedom to kind of treat things like in a utilitarian manner in my work. And utilitarian not to, like, mean to give it a lesser position, but to use it as exactly how I need it to be used. So I feel lucky in that way. I mean, my undergraduate is in art history, so I don't have this, like, background of you know, painting or photography. Like, when I'm working in photography, I can just pretend to be a photographer for a day.
I guess I how am I supposed to? I'm thinking. Maybe the way I could answer this question would be to say that I like this idea of making conceptual art that doesn't look like it, that actually looks, that is quite invested also in making work that is quite formal and invested in formal research. There's certainly a distance or a divide between the ways in which I work when I write and when I'm making artworks. And I mean, there's a relationship, but when I'm in the studio and I make work, it's quite an intuitive practice, something that I try to bring in the writing as well, but in a different manner. Maybe I like to. Sturtevant is an artist that I'm really interested in, and whose work I find very challenging in many ways, or writing as well. Although my practice is different. For those who don't know Sturtevant, she appropriated a lot of important male artists' work and just reproduced it exactly in the same way as they were made. She basically reproduced them completely, and that was her whole career. And for the longest time, of course, she was rejected from the art world because she was making copies, basically. But then there's this whole intellectual investigation with that practice, which I'm really interested in. So maybe in a similar fashion, I think I am interested in pushing these boundaries of what the certain mediums and the baggage that it comes with through the thinking of Sturtevant. Maybe I would think. Sorry, it's a bit unclear, but
That was great. Thank you, and thanks for that question. It's perfect.
Thank you all. Very excited to hear you talk about this. Okay, so I'm going to kind of set a scene, and then I'm curious to hear about what you think about the kind of legibility of the fact that we're talking about this at an art fair. So for me, I did my BFA at Lake Carr when they were still experimenting with the general fine arts program, and it was an interdisciplinary program, and the idea was like, you can take classes in any department, and we'll make that happen for you. You don't have to declare a major. So it's a very different idea to Concordia, but that program basically failed miserably, and everyone who was in it had a really bad time. And then I did the art writing MFA at Goldsmiths, and again, it was like, this is in between visual arts and writing, and it's interdisciplinary, and that program no longer exists because it was just too difficult for the administration to wrap their heads around. And it's been really interesting to see, like from 2010 to now, how the legibility of interdisciplinary practices is becoming accepted as normal. And I think in the beginning, or in the beginning of my involvement with it, it was very much about a kind of queering of discipline, or a kind of resistance to certain kinds of visibility, and a freedom of movement. So like if you can move between disciplines, you have more flexibility, and like, I'm not a writer, but I can read my writing in a gallery. Or like, I'm a scientist, but I want to talk about my findings in a gallery setting because the science community would laugh at me. You know, or like philosophers performing philosophy in galleries. So I'm wondering about your experience of like, have you always found it easy to be visible as an interdisciplinary practitioner, and if it's become easier over time?
Just before you answer, I think that I don't see your practices as interdisciplinary necessarily, and that's why I approached her. I really see you as working in this one medium and extending it to these other things, but definitely, yeah, do you see yourselves as interdisciplinary?
I mean, I see my practice as interdisciplinary.
I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to cut the question.
I mean, I almost wonder, like, how, because, you know, the first time I was in art school, I was in a program that no longer exists called Interdisciplinary Studies in the Fine Arts. I dropped out because I thought that being in a punk band was more interesting. But I don't know, like, when, you know, since I just finished my master's last week, like I went into an MFA program that was sold to me as a very interdisciplinary program. And then I found out that I had actually been situated in a printmaking concentration, and that, oh, well, actually, you can't do coursework in the dance department, and no, we're not going to let you do coursework in comparative lit, even though we told you could. So, I mean, I guess coming out of a very conservative institution, like I'm not really sure how much more openness there is to that, at least not like within like universities in Canada. I mean, I also see like, I mean, how much curation is like around very specific medium concerns that I mean, I find, without alienating a bunch of people, I find that kind of depressing. I would rather see a show around an idea than around a medium. I mean, I like to think that there's more openness, but, you know, I'm also very neurotic, so I'm not sure there is.
Well, I've been in academia for 10 years now, and you know, I don't think there is that much openness, but
they like to claim interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, but it's not necessarily happening. But my answer to that is like I do whatever I want, so I'm not really thinking of my practice as interdisciplinary. It's just as much as I'm just doing what I feel I should be doing, which goes in all kinds of directions, and it goes the same for how I kind of evolved in academia. I just do what I want. Might not be the best advice for anyone going into grad studies, but it's better to do what you feel is right for yourself than being alienated by an institution.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I had to change advisors 3 times in a 2-year program so that I could do what I want.
Yeah, no, I've done that too, you know.
I think that's really fair, though. I think that's really, that's what artists should be doing, because if you're going to be an artist, you should be able to do what you want.
Isn't that the
It should be free.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that the whole point of being an artist, so that you can do what the fuck you want?
Yeah.
But
somehow it happens that we forget about that. Yeah.
But it's true. But it's maybe I just want to mention, like, I did part of my MFA abroad. Like I did a semester in Oslo, in Norway, and it was really interesting actually to compare both ways of thinking about education in the arts, because I'm from Concordia. I did my master's at Concordia, and we do have departments. But then when I was doing that semester abroad, there was no departments, and it was like it was like the academy model. You know, it's like the academy, like European academy model, where everyone is together and you have access to all the shops that you want. And if you want to learn a thing, you go see the person from that shop and you say, "Can you teach me that thing?" And so there was. I thought it was really amazing, and the way that the semester was built, instead of having seminars or a studio course that lasts the entire semester, it was more workshop based. So you had like a course about artist writing, you had a course about a specific painter, it was really organic in this way, and you can build a program in a way that resembles a lot more what it is to be an artist outside of the academy, let's say, or outside of school, or in a professional, I hesitate to say that word, but in like in our context right now. But it's yeah, so I don't know. I wonder how that shifts depending on where you are in the world. But it's like, this is a really good friend of mine said that, like, word for word. She was like, "Why would I be an artist if I can't do what I want?" And I was like, yes, that's wonderful. Like, that's amazing. Of course. Like, yes. That is all.
So we have time for one more question.
I guess this question is mostly for Chloe, but maybe there's other reactions too. And I'm wondering about the medium of choreography, and the medium of bodies, but not just bodies, people, and how you in your work what that medium is for you, or how you work choreography, or how you work choreography. What is choreography? What it like as a medium, then integrated into sculpture or printmaking?
Well, I work with dance in 3 different ways, depending on the project. Sometimes we just full-on collaborate with a choreographer. I've worked a lot with Sarah Wendt, who's a choreographer and musician, and I'm doing a performance with her next month. I also do a lot of work through the ideas of tasks. So making up lists of tasks for the performers to do that are still somewhat open-ended to interpretation, so that there's this loss of control. The same way that when I was working more in installation, I couldn't necessarily control how things would decay. I would just have an idea that they would. So, I can like come up with lists of tasks. I mean, a lot of the early lists of tasks were like gestures that Yannick and I noticed ourselves doing in the studio, in the gallery, while installing our work, that looked absurd, that looked kind of poetic. So, working with a choreographer, working with tasks, and then I would say that most of what I do, though, with dance is through workshopping. So working with the performers and the objects, and just workshopping different ideas with the objects, and then building new objects in consequence, molding objects onto the bodies of the specific performers that I'm working with, and kind of like finding ways to have, for the performers to find like their relationship with the objects. And then once these kind of workshopping sessions are done, like kind of writing a score from what is observed within the workshop. So really basic stuff. I mean, I'm really lucky that as like a total neophyte working with dance, I do have a lot of colleagues who are very accomplished dancers and choreographers. So like they can like tell me if something that we're doing is really whack or not, and kind of just be there. Like, we always work with outside eyes, which is something that I guess is really standard in dance and theater. But yeah, it's really super straightforward.
Okay, thank you all for coming. Thanks for attending.